All right, this chapter is on biomechanics for energy system training for the AirRunner. Seemingly looks like a lot to go through there. Part and parcel, that's because biomechanics is fairly a complex topic for our discussion here for the AirRunner and energy system training. So I'm going to approach it as a way of allowing you, the user, or if you're a coach going to be prescribing it to someone, to just have these things going on in your mind, as opposed to us creating some technical concepts as to what they mean. So I'm going to go through just things that you could quite possibly think about when it comes to the biomechanics of being on the AirRunner. One of the areas that we will discuss that I think should override this, even for your conceptual framework of how you think about prescribing AirRunner energy system training, is the differences of running over ground versus running on the AirRunner. And that's not for an either or, is ought, plus minus situation. That's simply to allow you to grow your brain in terms of all the mechanical differences that happen that lead into really good prescriptions, okay? So the first thing that we have to discuss for biomechanics being on the AirRunner is really this real challenging, but I'm going to propose a way to do it through sustain into pain into gain training and having the correct kind of strength analysis, assessment, and then program for that, is closing this gap between understanding how people transition from walking into running. And just to go there to think about it allows us to formulate a really nice plan on what's inside of this for biomechanics. So when we do locomotory activity, as I said previously in the introduction of running in general and how we got to here, we are pretty well set up to create energy to move forward. Now that is not only the simple action of our legs moving back and forth and going across land. If you were to actually really slow down people when walking and even into running, you will see this, what I call a spiral energy happening, where the foot gets in a specific position as it's out in front of the person before it even hits the ground, and it prepares itself to accept the force that's coming, and then you put that force through the foot, up through the body, all the way to the head, happening through different kinds of forces, such that it can transfer that energy back down to that foot into the ground so that it can propel it forward. And this happens in this spiraling-like activity. If you wanted to do a simple, biomechanical analysis research on YouTube, I'm sure there's numerous videos out there that break down that skeleton, and it may be really nice for you to see that. How the foot is in this position before it hits. And then as it fits, there's this natural collapsing that should occur in that foot. And that in turn creates this spiraling action through the leg. And then it makes the hip and the core activate based upon that. And then it makes your upper body activate based upon that. And then as that foot moves through under the center of mass and through the back, now that entire action reverses back down through the foot. So that spiraling now rotates out, and then the foot pushes off in order to propel you forward. So that spiraling action happens even through walking and into running. But this is the interesting area which comes into the concept around metabolism. What that means is really the energy that's dissipated in the activities that you're doing. If it's not obvious to you, and you can just try that, just walk as fast as you can on the AirRunner and just check the average watts that you have on the screen when you're doing that, and then turn it into your regular running pace, okay? And just look at the difference in the average watts on the screen. Now in the odd case, there'll be someone who may go lower in wattage. That could be low efficiency running, not a huge experience, etc. But in a lot of cases, there's this massive gap that happens between walking and running. Now this may seem like a trivial conversation to a number of people, but it's very important to recognize in order for us to get into the correct mechanical things that need to occur and why we need to be strong enough with enough volume in order for us to actually perform on the AirRunner most effectively. It's because of this concept of the gap that we're trying to close between walking and running. So to back up on that, just to seemingly give you a concept as to why that's so important, this spiraling action and this gap that happens between, let's call it a non-flight phase into a flight phase of running, has major implications on the metabolic requirements necessary when you move. To make it in simple terms, when you walk, it's fairly easy. When you move into running, it's a massive difference in the total work that's required for that. And that's generally due to all these mechanical things that happen for the work that's going to take place. Also in this walk and run gap area comes into the question of efficiency, which gets highlighted, and why we'll talk about being as strong as possible and doing sustain first before pain, before gain, is that you can, in many terms, walk for a really long distance. So in a lot of cases, a number of people can walk for, let's say, 90 minutes straight, okay? And they'll walk for 90 minutes straight, practicing every couple of days as just a concept. And this has been practiced a lot with OPEX prescriptions over time. They'll practice that for months and months and months, right? But then to ask them to go from walking 90 minutes every second or third day, and then to turn it into running, the amount of time that it'll take for them to, let's say, stop or break down or decrease efficiency of stride when they turn it into running is a very small amount of time in relation to how much walking they did. So just think about that. Why, when you go from all that volume of walking, you can't just all of a sudden turn it into like running for 90 minutes as the next step that you do? The reason being is all of these things based upon the spiral energy, the flight phase, and the amount of work that's required, and it's because it's very inefficient, to transition from that walking to running. So there's this huge gap that we need to close in mechanics before we get into the prescription of, what seems very simple, is how do we just run on this, and then how do we run on this and get the best energy system training possible. So those are some things for you to think about in the mechanics of it. It's also very important to recognize that there's different forces acting in the concept only of running when on the AirRunner. It's well known now that lateral forces, vertical forces, and horizontal forces are at play in multiple different paces of running. And it's just important for you to recognize that. And you may just be, as a user, thinking, I just want to run on this thing, or a coach is saying, I just want to prescribe energy system training. You have to back up into this physical atmosphere and say, well, what kind of forces are at play when someone does the action of being on there? Right? So just think about that. You're going to have some lateral forces at play because there's some stability components, right? Based upon it being, it's not necessarily a super super hard ground surface, right? You're going to have some vertical forces at play, so just think about the person coming down onto the ground and their energy that's being dissipated from that flight phase and then landing, right? So these are things to even think about, makes it obviously different than walking. Walking, there's hardly any vertical forces, they're a very small amount, but then of course when you get into that flight phase, the body rises, pressure increases, and then you have to come down and create a change in that force in order to propel you forward. And then of course there's horizontal forces. At different speeds, there will be different kinds of horizontal forces, but just think about that. I have to go in this direction, right? But I'm standing up straight. So in order for me to move in this direction, there has to be something that forces the action to go back this way. Now there is some, I would say, and not to stop us there, but there's some major differences in those horizontal forces in regards to outside running, or sort of running on the ground versus running on this, because this actually spins underneath you. So there's a number of things at play that vary up those horizontal forces. This is just important to keep in the back of your head for the mechanics is when you get on that. The two major things at play for these forces that you should consider is what's called ground contact time and just ground contact. There's lots of evidence to show that there are some differences in it, and it's not really important for this conversation. I would just basically say when we get down to transfer, I'll discuss it in more detail, but it should not be for specific high-speed, elite running scenarios, and it should not be for rehabilitative scenarios. But for people looking to do fitness on the AirRunner, it's a fantastic thing that you could be using. And the reason why we want to get really picky for that for rehab or elite performance of running is that ground contact time is different on here than on the ground itself or just running outside. And based upon how the curve is set up, the different kinds of forces, the density, etc., that's the reason why it should be apparently obvious to you that they're just two different things and treat them as such. And secondly, what's most important, just based upon forces, which we'll talk about here, that could be a positive thing, is the stability component, meaning that you do have some forces that are applied here, the density of the surface, that are different on this in relation to outside. Therefore, this may be more unstable, if you want to think about it, in relation to being outside. So outside on a ground surface, that's not going to move underneath you, but this does have slightly changes in this position as you land, right? And changes in this position as you land, and then it changes in this position as you land. And outdoor is not like that, where you have to use your body to propel against that unmovable force. And so you could create a more unstable position on this. Last point on that, the carryover from this and evidence from treadmill running or self-propelled mechanisms, non-motorized mechanisms in metabolism, it's being sold as a great cardio burner or a great effective workout because there's been some preliminary research to show the difference in the metabolic output of this versus running outside. I wouldn't wrap everything around that research and say that it's the holy grail of metabolism and calorie burning simply because of that, but just think about it. If this is a more unstable situation and it's different than running outside, can you see how that would provide a different metabolic stimulus? So I just want you to think there that it should just make sense to you that it probably provides a different metabolic stimulus, but it doesn't mean it's better overall simply because it provides that metabolic stimulus, just in case we want to do some piling on of cardiovascular benefits of air running and compared to being outside. Friction is a major thing that you have to consider inside of this, meaning that you can get, I think it's like 6 different versions of really well-known quality-made curve-style self-propelled treadmills today. And each of them will have slight differences in the friction. That means that as you move this belt, it will move either on its own or every time that body weight force acts upon it, it will move with a slightly differential in friction per machine. I will just qualify to say that being super honest with trying all the other options, the AirRunner provides, I would say, the most efficient friction based upon fitness users. And that would mean that people that have done all the other machines, including myself, and then they get on the AirRunner, they would make commentary of it moves underneath me, it doesn't feel like it slips when I have really hard ground contact, it doesn't feel like I have to do as minimal kind of braking. And this comes from people, including myself, who have some running experience, so our feeling on this based upon friction makes it optimal, I believe, for a curved, non-motorized piece of machinery for running, okay? But it's important for you to know that friction is at play here and recognize that the friction outside, for example, is going to be very different than the friction that's going to be provided on here. As I said, just for your brain to kind of get an idea of the differences in outdoor versus treadmill running or the AirRunner itself, it allows you just to grow your brain in terms of the prescription for energy system training. So that's why we're going there. But it's important to know the differences. When you're outside, we forget that we're actually moving through space. So when you're on the AirRunner, you're staying still. So the chances of you cooling more effectively is going to be less appropriate inside on the AirRunner, if that makes sense, okay? So this may also make sense now when you see all this piling on of metabolic output for individuals. When they said that they burn more calories on an AirRunner versus outside, well, when you're outside, your cooling is capable based upon the air that's passing by you. Therefore, if you're cooling down, you are wasting less energy, right? As it's measured based upon metabolic output. So there's a lot of things that go into the measurement of that, but it is important for you to recognize that the cooling is different. This is a side note thing for training, that if you are going to be training at a really high intense level, just take into consideration the air temperature and the air that you have moving on you when you are on the treadmill, because you can get into a metabolic scenario where you get quite tired, and it's simply because you didn't take into consideration how much you cool when you're outside just because you are moving through air, okay? Safety, well, it's an inside joke, but no one has ever been hit by a car on an AirRunner, but it does give you some concepts of understanding, you know, honestly, even in my local community for biking and running, I have to take into consideration cyclists and other vehicles and motorcycles and cars and trucks that are around me. So the safety aspect, it's a hard stop no comparison, that it's very safe to be inside on the AirRunner, and it's something that can't be unspoken of, right, based upon what can happen when you're in that situation. Also talking about safety and carrying over into surface, when you're outside, there could be slippery surfaces, you could be in colder settings, the surface may change. Also, the surface density is different. Outside is harder, this is softer. You have to recognize that in terms of like volume attained, shoe wear, and other things that you want to consider. That's another big positive of this. It being a softer surface, it may be really advantageous to a number of people who can't handle the ground contact, the ground force reaction that occurs when people are outside. It's just good to recognize the difference in that. Speed. On this one here, this is why really this is not the best for speed skill training or acceleration training. When you're, again, just think about someone who's a sprinter off the blocks. They have to do a tremendous amount of horizontal forces in order to move themselves, where they stoop over, not fall on their face, and transfer energy to go that way. Remember, when you try to excel on this thing moves underneath you. So it's almost like being in a starting blocks, and all of a sudden then you have a treadmill that's underneath you. Can you see how that wouldn't be appropriate? So it's not the best, I would say, for the skill of being super fast, and the metabolic cost when you're outside, when you're doing acceleration work, is alarmingly higher than acceleration work on this. And it's just important to recognize that. And you can just even feel it. Just get on here, spin that thing quick, and then sprint for 3 or 4 seconds, and then go outside and then sprint for 3 or 4 seconds. They're like 2 completely different exercises and different modalities just based upon that. But that's important to know the difference. I already talked about this, but we'll hit it home again. This is going to be possibly a more unstable surface in all things being equal, just based upon the density of the belt itself and the reflection that you're going to get back into the body for it, and just recognize that you will have that metabolic interplay because of that. When you stop outside, it's a natural deceleration. Just think about that. But this thing keeps spinning as you want to stop. So it's just an important consideration for deceleration practice, and why it's possibly also shouldn't be classified inside this speed, agility, quickness training concept, because it's very hard for you to decelerate naturally on this. Whereas when you're outside, just think about someone's running and then they have to slow down, and they have to do that with actual decelerating properties, right? And that could be a learned thing that transfers over to sport, but when you're on the AirRunner, it's not going to be happening. So you just need to recognize there's some differences in that. Ground contact time. If I was to describe, if you want to think about the curve aspect of the AirRunner, and just take the curve in itself in 2 points and finish that in a full circle, right? Just think about that, right? So if you have that, it's going to finish in a full circle. Yet when we run on land, if you think about it, it's really hard to picture this, but if you were to keep extending that circle extends like this, right? It's a big, large one. It's called the planet. So just think about that. But the top of that circle is really flat, right? And it doesn't spin. Whereas this circle goes the opposite direction, and we're running inside of that. That's just important to know, that the contact time on here is going to be different. We don't really need to, it's actually moot points to discuss the ground contact time and the ground force reaction differences from on ground to here. You just need to know it's different, right? And it shouldn't take a lot of introspection to look at this and go, yeah, of course, the foot's going to hit here, and then my body's going to be in this position, whereas if I'm on the ground, my body's in this position, but my foot maybe hits in a different spot. But that's important to know because of the thing I talked about for elite training of running or for rehab. It may be a specificity thing that you need to overcome, and you probably shouldn't be going after this for ground contact time or ground force reaction scenarios. Another thing we forget about, which is also very important, you can't do hill training on this. There are some self-propelled ones that do have some variations in height. It actually doesn't make any sense with the curve to have that. That's besides the point, but you can't actually do the hill concept on this. So the positives around the motorized treadmills that had that were some kind of carryover to some similarities to hill training. And without getting too deep in it, there's a lot of benefits to hill training for numerous things around tendon strengthening, stride frequency and length scenario improvements, skill transfer into sprinting, and just it's good strengthening activity. The positive thing about doing hills outside was that you had to get the same effect from that skill transfer activity, but you also had to run down the hills, which was strengthening activity. And you just can't get this with the AirRunner, but it's just something important to know. Lastly, for biomechanics, I already talked about it indirectly, but we'll just talk about it again in a little bit more detail. is how you transfer this over to running. And I really just think it's a moot point. I want you to think about running outside and running on the AirRunner as just two different skills. But when we get into this idea of saying one is going to be more beneficial than the other, or one is going to be helping this one be more beneficial, it's really an argument that you shouldn't get into unless your skill is elite running, where you think that running is a major aspect of your sport and you have to be really good at it, or it's in a rehabilitative setting for possibly the same context. Then I would say that you probably shouldn't be playing on the AirRunner to get all the benefits of it, thinking it's going to carry over to ground reaction forces, or ground force reaction, as well as ground contact time and deceleration and stability that happens on a ground surface, okay? And we'll talk a little bit more about this inside of the sport as well to kind of hit it home for where it can play a role. So that was lengthy, thank you so much. But we had to discuss that because some of the missing links in terms of how you actually do work and all the intricate things that happen to our body as we're on the AirRunner, we forget about that. So as I lay out this concept of assessing it and running appropriately so that you can do it for sustainable purposes, you'll now start to see how all these things work into the reasoning behind why we prescribe what we prescribe.